Awesome. Thanks for that awesome intro. Yeah, a Python Serverless URL Shortener for all your domains. It's really fun. It's a really good segue from Nick's talk earlier where he finished with tinyurl.com. Nick, after this session, I'm confident that you better take my repo and you better set up your own URL shortener and you won't need to use tinyurl.com anymore. And that's the whole point of this project. That's why I want to talk through it. As Shafraz said, I'm an AWS Serverless hero. That's new. I've only been there for a month now, so that's all still new. And I am building serverlessdna.com, so do check that out. It's going to have some awesome updates coming. I've just got to find some time. What are we going to talk about today? Look, I'll keep this. I don't think it's going to be a very long talk, but let's go. I'm going to talk about what URL shorteners do. We're going to talk about what did I build. We'll have a quick look at the architecture. There's 1,000 different ways you can build things in AWS. We're going to look at the way that I used to build this and maybe look at a bit of why. Look at how I built it. Look at SAM Cli and Python and delve into an open source project that I've got available on GitHub that is my better method of using SAM with Python, in my opinion. It's a bit opinionated, so be prepared for an opinionated talk. Then we're going to look at how you can build this thing for all your own domains, and I'll talk you through the gotchas of the project as they stand today. And then we'll talk, hopefully I've got enough time, we'll talk about some of the things I learned along the way. So what do URL shorteners do? Basically, they turn something like this on the left-hand side, so https://wamsle/Powertools can get turned into that really awful URL on the right-hand side, the really long one that you don't want to type in, and it's not very catchy. I decided that Wamsles is my that's my handle on all my socials for tech. So I decided to create a URL shortener on the Spanish domains. So now I actually have Wamsles/whatever I want, and that's my shortened URL. So that's what I'm using, and that's what they do. That's all they do. It's a very simple test case. It's actually a really interesting use case of being able to explore serverless and how to build serverless, which is more about what I'm going to be talking about today. Is how did I build it? Why did I build it? And how you can build things really quickly and easily. So quick snapshot of the architecture. It's a really simple architecture. On the right-hand side is the browser. So you can see my cursor moving. The browser is going to talk to Route 53, which is going to redirect it to the custom domain on an Amazon API Gateway, which will have a certificate associated with it, so it's all HTTPS secure. Which will, it'll call the AWS Lambda handler. We'll talk about how I built that. I'll dig into the code a little bit. It's a really simple project, so we can dig right into everything around this. And the AWS Lambda is just basically going to do a lookup based on the information you provide on the URL to see, hey, this slug you provided me, what's the actual destination? And it's going to do one of two things. It's either going to return a 301 permanent redirect. And now with URL shorteners work on the premise of HTTP status codes. So I'm going to get a little bit technical for a couple of minutes. The two key ones that I use in this project is 301 for a permanent redirect. And what that's going to do is every time your browser types in that particular short URL, once it's got a permanent redirect cached, it means that every other time you go and look at that up on your browser, it's not going to hit my service anymore. It's going to use your local cache. So that's going to give some efficiencies of people not overusing the service. And serverless is cheap and it's all free tier anyway. So there's no risks here. Really, really safe. The other one is what I've developed is if someone puts a slug in that doesn't exist, I'm actually doing a redirect to a central domain, and I'm redirecting everybody to my serverlessdna.com site as the standard. So it actually feels like every shortened URL is valid. But that one does a 302, which is a temporary redirect, because we want to do a temporary redirect on those guys, so that if you do introduce a slug that matches something that someone's typed in before, they'll actually get the new content, which is what we want. So that's the premise of how this thing works and how all URL shorteners do function. So that's as hard as it is. So let's dig into what's next is how did I build it? So look, if anyone follows me on LinkedIn or on Twitter or Slack, I'm a fan of SAM Cli. I'm a fan of serverless. I'm a serverless hero, so I have to be a fan of serverless. But SAM Cli, I really like SAM Cli because it's really simple and it's really straightforward. And I think it's a really great way of getting started with building out serverless, certainly for smaller projects. SST, as Nick talked about, is also a really good, I'm not going to get into all the debates about ISE. Any ISE is good. Any infrastructure as code that you do for serverless is good, and you should be doing it regardless of the flavor you like, because everyone has their flavor they like. I actually think SST is pretty cool. There's a lot of good features. So Nick's doing a really good job there. But I'm going to talk about SAM CLI, and we're doing a combination of SAM CLI and Python. And I actually feel that SAM CLI and Python is a little bit messy. And so what we're going to do is we're going to dig into, let's take a look at the project. Let's have a look at the code. Let's go jump into, I'm going to switch my screen. So hopefully everyone's seeing the screen change. Just confirming.
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Just want to make sure, because sometimes they're slow. I've been on a lot of Teams projects where if you Alt Tab, people don't actually see the change. So look, I'm using SAM CLI, which is very simple YAML file. Everyone loves YAML files. I'm a bit of a Python head at the moment, so YAML files are great. I love YAML files for that reason, because Python and YAML, match made in heaven. I'm sure people will disagree. I can't see chat, so if I'm inciting some riots on chat, then all well and good. What I like about SAM CLI and SAM templates is it's very close to CloudFormation. So at the end of the day, we need to understand CloudFormation a little bit, and I feel that things like Serverless Framework and SAM CLI, they give you that feel of CloudFormation, and I think that's really valuable to understand, because at the end of the day, CloudFormation is the templating language of choice and the templating engine that I feel we should be using for building out serverless products. So I think that's where we really should be focusing when we start building, because we can learn. And it builds out these. Basically, I'm building out a DynamoDB table. It's a little bit more verbose than SST, than what Nick provided, but it is also very simple, and it's based around CloudFormation. So you'll see here, I've got DynamoDB table. I've used a full DynamoDB table here. SAM CLI introduces some other constructs for building out CloudFormation, and they use these things called AWS serverless tags rather than the AWS service tags. So you can also do a serverless table, but it's much simpler in operation, and it didn't suit my project. So I've actually used a couple of other features of DynamoDB that aren't available through the serverless table. So I've decided not to use that for that reason. I'm building out a very simple HTTP API because I want to play with those. I haven't played with them a lot. I learned a few interesting things about them, which I'll share as part of this talk. And the other thing I have is the Lambda function, and that's really all it is. It's really simple. It's a HTTP API. It's calling a Lambda function, and we're triggering into a DynamoDB table. What's really annoying about SAM and Python? Now, when you start up a SAM template, the code structure I've got here is very opinionated. It's based off a template I've got on GitHub. So I'm just going to jump over to GitHub. Here's one I opened up earlier. It's built off this AWS SAM template Python that I built out. And it's an opinionated version of the hello world from the SAM CLI Python examples using Powertools, because I like Powertools. And what I've done is one of the annoying things about SAM is they don't group things logically. So if you have multiple services, it becomes really unclear where to put them and how you should structure them. So I've created this services folder. And that services folder is where basically you store your services. In this case, it's a hello world sample for the template. Or if you're doing something different, you can name that whatever you want. You can have multiple services. What SAM also does when it builds, when you go into these folders, they're all treated as modules by Python if you understand Python. And the code's in app.py, which has the handle code in. Now, to deploy this, it requires a requirements.txt file at this level for SAM CLI to actually build it correctly. And I find that really, really confusing to manage dependencies in multiple directories for each of the services you're going to be deploying. So what I do instead is, because I like poetry, I'm not a Pit person, I'm a poetry person. You're either a Node person or a Python person, and when you're a Python person, you're either a poetry person or a Pit person. So there we go. So every language has its factions, and that's the faction that I belong to. I really like poetry. What I like about it is I can use poetry centrally from the root of the terminal. So poetry has this Py project TOML with all my dependencies. Now what I do with this is I can actually switch the dependencies around. I actually call groups based on service name. So you see this little shortener name here. That dependency matches in my services folder, the shortener folder. And this requirements.txt, you'll see here it's grayed out because I don't manage these. These aren't managed at all. I've got a make file in here that does a whole lot of auto magic. And basically the make file has a build and it has a deploy. It has all the magic things that we do with SAM. So you don't have to remember all the SAM commands. You can do make deploy, make build. And one of the annoying things about SAM CLI, when you do a SAM deploy, if you've made changes and haven't done a SAM build, it's not going to work. It's just going to fail. It's going to go, bom, bom, no changes until you do a SAM build. So I keep doing that. I did it all the time. So I've actually created a SAM, a make deploy, which actually does the build first. So it forces the build. So the make file does there's a whole lot of magic in the make file. I'm not going to go into details about that. But effectively, what the magic does is this little script called make dependencies. And what it does is it exports the poetry dependencies into each of those services. It'll iterate over the services folders, and it will basically take that shortener and use that as a group name to say export the dependencies for this particular service. What that allows me to do is it allows me to centrally manage my dependencies for my code in the IDE. It means all my formatting and all my code hinting within the IDE is 100% working, so I can actually get all this fabulous, you know, I can actually start typing things in, and I get all the tracing magic, which is cool. That's what we want, without having to have a horrible environment of all these requirements files everywhere. So that's really the thing I don't like about SAM CLI and Python. That's why I've built this particular project and that template, to make life really, really simple, to make it simpler to build out services, to build out folders, to build out and manage dependencies. And I think that's a real problem when you're using SAM CLI, in my opinion, especially with Python, because of the way it works with its build. It basically takes those services folders, mounts it into a container, and will compile inside that container the build and push it all into the AWS SAM. So that's what I don't like about SAM CLI, and that's why I've created that GitHub project, which you can all grab off my GitHub page and use for your own purposes. So that's a quick look at the project, about how it's structured. So we've got the code, we've got the shortener, we've got the app. The app POI is just a really simple API that we're using Python Powertools for Lambda here. I love Python Powertools for Lambda. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but it's basically like a fast API, or if you're familiar with Serverless Express, very, very similar to building out APIs. You can build out your functions, and the functions can basically just get redirected, and we either do a temporary or a permanent redirect. So the code is really, really simple. There's nothing really hard about what we're doing. And the magic of breaking down the pathing happens by using the handler code, which is just this magic app.resolve, which breaks up all those decorators and allows our service to actually work. So that's a quick run through of SAM CLI and why I've used the template that I have. But how can you build it yourself? Now, this is what I'm going to get to. I'm going to quickly just go through how can you build this yourself. There's three things, and Nick, I hope you're paying attention, because you can actually go and build this yourself after this. And I'd love some feedback on that. So let me take a couple of minutes. I've got a few more minutes. So really everything, 99, just like AWS, 99.999999995% of my project is fully automated through SAM CLI. There's two things that aren't. There's a little bit of ClickOps. And let's talk about ClickOps. Let's talk about the ClickOps bit. It's all about certificates, because they're really funny. Certificates, they're a bit hard, and I haven't dug into how to automate those. I'll be happy for any feedback from people who have. It'd be really cool to learn that. But I haven't done that. So what we're going to do is I'm actually going to go and deploy this, and you can set this up. And there's two ClickOps bits for your project that you need to go. Now, as the previous speaker was talking about, Control Tower is really cool. I use Control Tower. We're going to use my development account, because we should be doing development in our development account. Now, the ClickOps here comes down to two things. It's the certificate manager and Route 53. Route 53 is all about your domains, so it's all about hosted zones. And there's two configuration elements that we need to pass into my template that makes it completely reusable for all of your domains. So you can actually deploy this multiple times for multiple domains. We're going to be using my dev.slsdna.com. This is my URL shortener for serverlessdna.com that I'm going to create links for and start using as part of pushing out my advertising. Now, the routed zone here uses two things. I have a hosted zone name, or it has a hosted zone ID. And when you use CloudFormation, you can use one of these two ways of hooking up you can automatically hooking in your certificates and domains into your custom domains and make that alias work automatically. That's automated, but you need to grab your actual hosted zone ID for my particular template. So we need to understand that hosted zone ID. And the other thing we need to understand is we need to go into Mr. Certificate Manager. And in the Certificate Manager, we need the ARN of the certificate that we're going to work. Because what I want to do here today, I'm actually going to use a wildcard domain. And there's a really funny thing with HTTP APIs. Your certificate domain has to exactly match the custom domain that you're deploying on API Gateway when you use a HTTP API, which is the V2 API Gateway. So it's the new one. That was really weird to me. I didn't understand that at first, and it really confused me. But names have to exactly match. But the really cool thing is, with HTTP APIs, if you have an asterisk in front, you can create a wildcard domain, which is pretty cool. And that's what I'm going to deploy today. We're going to actually go deploy that wildcard domain. So we can actually use this guy. So we need to grab our certificate ID. Not just that, we need to grab the ARN. We're going to need the ARN to configure our stack. Now, once you've checked the code out, what we're going to do, we're going to quickly, how am I going for time, chaperones?
Timing wise, you're all good, Michael.
Yeah,
Let's
good.
Go.
So what we're going to do is we're going to do a SAM build first, because we should always do a SAM build. If you don't want to do a SAM build, you can just do a make build. Because I've deployed this multiple times, what we need to do is the make file works, but I haven't quite got, I'm not really ace at make files yet. I've got to do a bit more work on this project. But once that's built, we're ready to go. Now, to deploy this and get this ready for your use, we can do SAM deploy / guided. Now, SAM deploy guided is going to go off and do all the things we want to do. The only other thing I'm going to do is do a / profile, because I use Leap and I'm using Leap, so I need to get my CLI environment into my developer account. Leap, if people aren't using it, really great open source project. I really highly recommend this. It's great for getting access to SSO enabled AWS accounts, even enterprise ones. I use this for enterprise access and it works brilliantly. Don't tell Accenture I said that. Just saying. But it does work well. It works well for enterprise environments. Quite slightly different setup if you've got custom SSO, but it works in all those environments and it's beautiful. I love it. It gives me command line access to any AWS account really simply by basically just, I can have multiple leads if I have profile names. I can have multiple leads set up, which makes life really easy. So let's just call that dev. Now, when you do SAM deploy guided, it's going to ask you for some questions. What's my stack name? So we'll call this URL. We'll call it short URL wild. It's going to ask you the region. I like AP Southeast 2 because that's just what I want to, that's where I install everything. It's going to ask for now it's going to ask for parameters. So I've parameterized and set up inside the template file a number of parameters. And these are the parameters that will enable you to deploy this for any domain that you own. So we need the certificate ARN. There's one that I copied earlier. You need to give the domain name. This is the actual domain name. Now, it has to be the domain name from our certificate. It has to, like I said before, it has to exactly match. So it has to exactly match star.dev.slsdna.com because that's what we're deploying to, because I'm not touching the live version. I'm just going to use my dev version. And then we need the parameter for the hosted zone ID. Now, that's the only other piece of ClickOps we need. And then we're going to go back to Route 53. I'm going to grab our Route 53 ID. Now, you can, when you do custom domain setups with HTTP API, you can do hosted zone name, or you can do hosted zone ID. Now, I went and copied hosted zone name, put that in the CloudFormation template, thinking that would work, and it failed. And I didn't know why. It took me ages to work out why it failed. I gave up with that, and I just started to use the hosted zone ID instead, because that just simply worked. What I found out when I was writing, I wrote a blog article about this. What I found out when I was writing the blog article is with CloudFormation, when you use the hosted zone name, you have to actually use the name, but put a dot at the end of it, which is a throwback to Route 53 DNS domain name resolution in Route 53. But you can actually do it with hosted zone name. So I'm actually switching the project around a little bit, probably release a new version that uses hosted zone name, because names are nicer than IDs. We remember those so much better. So we're going to put the hosted zone ID in. And then we need to give it a redirect URL. Now I'm going to redirect this one to one of my favorite websites. If I can find, yes, my favorite website, Powertools. Everybody should go Powertools. We're going to redirect to the Powertools site. Log level, this is just for logging. We leave it as error, so nothing goes to our logs. Confirm the changes. Yeah, we'll confirm the changes. I like that. SAM needs permission to be able to deploy, create roles. Yes, that's fine. And the only other thing is, do we want to have zero rollback? We just take the defaults. Now, there's a warning here about, hey, your API has no authentication. That's correct. It doesn't. And we have to actually tell SAM CLI, yeah, that's okay, because we don't want this to be authenticated because it's an open URL on the web. Save that to a file, and then it's going to ask us to where to save it. So it's going to save it to my samconfig.toml. And then we can give it we'll call it open mic as the environment. So this enables, when I do SAM deploy guided, it's actually setting up a brand new environment to allow me to recreate a brand new stack. So this is the way you can actually deploy it to exactly the same account multiple times. And what you'll find is once I hit enter on this, that's now going through and doing all the things it needs to do to go and deploy. But what it's also doing is it's saved this into my samconfig.toml. So you see I've got wildcard, I've got prod, I've got my Wamsles one, and I've got my SLS-DNA prod, and I've got dev2, and now I've got open mic as well. So I've got all these configurations and all these different versions of the URL shortener that can exist. So you can actually deploy this stack with those parameters multiple times. We're going to go off and do that. I'm not going to sit here and watch this. I'm going to go back to my preso as is going. That's all you need to do to deploy a URL shortener for your own domain and make that work on the web. But remember, we've actually done this with the wildcard, which is really cool. It's a really cool feature of HTTP API that I can think of so many use cases for that I think is really cool. I wanted to showcase that specifically tonight as well. Yeah, let's build it. First, the ClickOps. We did that. I should have gone to my slide. Should have practiced that better. Wildcard, certificate, ARN, route 3. They're the two things you need to know. So what did I learn about doing this? Don't name your cloud resources. That's one key best practice of building in the cloud is don't name your resources. Let your IAC tool do it. Automate the naming. That means you won't get clashes. You know, everyone knows that your S3 bucket names have to be globally unique. Just don't name them. Just doesn't matter what they're called because they're referenced in the stack. Consider when you're building out a project, consider what your external dependencies are. What are the things that you want to change if you deploy this multiple times? Because they become parameters, as you saw there. They become the things that drive the reuse of a project, and they're really important. You can use CloudFormation parameters like I did today. You can also reference SSM parameter store as a different method. There's a variety of mechanisms. These are the two that I prefer. These are my two preferred methods. HTTP API gateways, the main thing I learned, your domain in the certificate domain must exactly match the custom domain that you're deploying on API Gateway. If it doesn't, it's not going to work. It's just going to fail, which is really annoying because it doesn't actually tell you why it failed. It just fails. And it's not until you try and set up manually you get more of an insight into why it failed. Classic CloudFormation, classic AWS CloudFormation, that one. Consider, I've also, the reason why I did DynamoDB, I mentioned the DynamoDB reference of the table, why I didn't use the serverless one. I wanted to trial using delete protection for data resources because when I was building this, I actually deleted my initial stack by default by my mistake. No one was using it, so it was all cool, but I did actually delete my entire database. So delete protection for your data resources. I think you should turn those on. Route 53 configuration by CloudFormation resource, hosted zone names have to have a dot at the end. It's not what you see in the console. That's not what they mean when they say CloudFormation. It has to have a dot in the end. And it's hidden in a line inside the CloudFormation documentation. Cool. They're the key things that I learned along the way. So right now, if we go back to our URL, is one I prepared earlier. So now what we'll find is now we've actually deployed this. We've now got a wildcard deployed on our API gateway. So I'm actually going to go and use this. We can actually go, now we haven't got anything in there at the moment. So if I go /hello, and if I run this, you're going to see I got a 302 found, and it's redirected me to my default URL. So that's the default. If you want to go and add a URL, I don't have a UI for this yet. I haven't built it. I haven't got around to that yet. like I said, I'm just getting, as Sarah said, I'm just getting started. But you can easily add that, because I just use DynamoDB as the result. I haven't named the table, but it's easy to find. It'll be based on your stack name. So your stack name, short URL wild, URL database with a random figure. What we can do then, we can explore the table items. You can just add one, and we can add in something for hello. And we add a new attribute because I didn't define the entire structure. And then we can just add in Powertools, of course. That's where we want to go. All roads lead to Powertools in my demo today. And that's what we're going to do. So now I've added that. And immediately, if we go into our /hello, we're now getting a 301 move permanently back to our browser. And it's going to redirect to the magic of Powertools. And you can do that in your browser as well. So anyone who's out there can actually go into their browser. And instead of typing that really long URL, you can just go HTTP. Now, the magic of this is I can actually go anything .dev.slsdna.com, because that's the domain. I do a wildcard domain. When I do a wildcard domain, whatever this is at the front will resolve to my API gateway with the star in it. And I think that's magical. So many use cases. I really have so many use cases. And it failed. No. There we go, and it's redirected. I don't know why it failed. Must have been a DNS glitch. I do know the Safari doesn't like this thing, so that's an interesting thing. But a lot of different use cases. What that actually means is, we did anything before. We can actually do Shafraz, and we can just type in anything, and this domain goes through. So it's redirected, right? That goes through because it's wildcard domain, which is really interesting. I didn't actually know this existed until I was digging into why can't I attach my wildcard certificate to my SLS, my sls.dev.slsdna.com. Why couldn't I put a wildcard on that and have like a star.slsdna.com? Because HTTP API is very specific. Certificate name must exactly match your custom domain name. And if you wildcard it, do you know what? I've got a wildcard Route 53 entry, and I've got a wildcard domain on the API Gateway, which I think is absolutely magical. And I think that's the most exciting thing I discovered. And I'm just bursting to share it, as you can see. Thanks for listening. I hope you find my URL shortener useful. I will share the shortener links on GitHub so you can grab it for yourself, and you can go and deploy it now. And it's not hard. It's not easy. It's not hard to do. And you can scan the QR code, give me feedback, or you can use my tiny URL on the right.